One ordinary man, the most powerful woman in the city, and a gun pressed against her skull. Mason Carter had no plan that night except to drive home, shower, and fall into bed before his son woke up asking for pancakes. He was tired in the specific way that single fathers get tired. Not just in his body, but somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where hope used to live more comfortably. He had $43 in his checking account, a transmission that clicked when he accelerated, and absolutely no reason to be a hero. Then he heard the screaming. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. The Meridian Grand sat on the corner of 5th and Lakeview, like a building that had decided long ago it was better than everything around it. 42 floors of glass and polished steel, a lobby that smelled like imported flowers and old money, valets who wore white gloves even in August. Mason had dropped 3 fares there that week. A corporate attorney who didn't tip, a couple who argued the entire ride without once acknowledging he existed, and a woman who'd left a designer scarf on the back seat and called twice asking if he'd found it, which he had. But the smell of her perfume on the fabric made him feel something complicated he didn't have a name for. He pulled to the curb at 11:47 p.m. to end his shift. The app showed no more ride requests in the queue, and the dashboard clock glowed amber in the dark cab. He reached for his thermos, cold coffee, the kind that tastes like a broken promise, and was twisting off the cap when the sound hit him. Not a scream exactly, more like the beginning of one that got cut off. Mason set down the thermos. He looked toward the hotel's side entrance, the one that didn't have the valet stand, the one tucked behind a row of ornamental hedges where the security cameras had a blind angle. He noticed these things automatically, a habit left over from 12 years in the Army that had never fully switched off. 2 figures stood in the yellow cone of a parking lamp. One was tall, dressed in black, wearing a mask that covered everything above the jaw. The other was a woman in a dark blazer, her back pressed against the stone wall, her evening bag dropped on the ground between them. The man in the mask had his left forearm pressed across her collarbone, pinning her. His right hand held something that caught the light. Mason was out of the car before he'd made any conscious decision to move. His door didn't close properly. It never did. So it swung back open behind him with a hollow metal sound, and the man in the mask heard it and turned his head. That half second of distraction was all Mason needed. He crossed the distance fast and low, the way they'd trained him, weight forward, arms up, and he hit the man from the side rather than head on, because head on was how people got shot. The gun went off. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed space between the hedges and the wall, and Mason felt the pressure of the discharge near his left ear, a hot rushing sensation that made the world go briefly white. The bullet hit the stone somewhere above them. The woman made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mason had the man's gun arm torqued behind his back now, wrist bent at an angle that made continuing to hold anything impossible, and the weapon clattered onto the pavement. The man fought. He was big, bigger than he'd looked from the car, and whoever had hired him had not hired him for his conversational skills. He threw his head back trying to catch Mason's face, drove an elbow into his ribs, twisted hard enough that Mason felt something pull in his shoulder. Mason had been hit harder. He planted his feet and kept the arm locked and drove the man forward into the wall face first. The fight went out of him after that. Not immediately. There was one more surge, a kind of desperate thrashing, and then something changed in his body. Mason had felt it before. The exact moment when someone decides the math doesn't work in their favor anymore. And he went still. "Don't," Mason said. Just the one word. He didn't raise his voice. The man stayed still. They stood like that for maybe 4 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Mason's shoulder was sending signals he was choosing to ignore. His left ear had a high-pitched tone running through it. He became aware, slowly, of the woman pressed against the wall to his right, breathing in shallow, rapid bursts. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. She didn't answer immediately. He heard her swallow. "No," she said. "I don't think so." Her voice was steadier than he expected. Not steady like someone who wasn't scared. She was clearly scared. He could see her hand shaking from where he stood. But steady like someone who was choosing to sound that way, like composure was a decision she was capable of making even in the middle of this. "Can you call 911? "Yes." A pause. "Yes, I can do that." He heard her find her phone. She'd dropped her bag but kept the phone in her blazer pocket. Smart, some part of him noted, or habit. The man in the mask made one more attempt, not to escape but to pivot, to try to get a look at Mason's face, and Mason leaned in close to his ear and said, quietly and without particular emotion, "I wouldn't." The man went still again. The police took 11 minutes. Mason spent them with his knee in the small of the attacker's back, his hand maintaining the wrist lock, listening to the woman finish her call and then stand in silence 3 feet away. The ornamental hedges rustled in the wind. A car passed on Fifth Avenue, slow and oblivious. Somewhere above them, a window in the hotel was lit, and a silhouette appeared briefly behind the glass and then withdrew. When the patrol cars arrived, lights strobing blue and white across the stone facade, Mason stepped back and let the officers take over. He gave his statement to a young officer who kept glancing at his hands as he wrote. Mason had a bruise forming across his knuckles and hadn't noticed, and answered every question with the flat economy of someone who'd been debriefed many times in his life. The woman gave her name to a detective who arrived 12 minutes after the first units. Mason was standing near his car by then, door still open, cold coffee still in the thermos. He wasn't trying to listen, but the night was quiet, and the detective spoke at a normal volume. Amelia Sterling. The name meant something, though Mason needed a moment to connect it. Sterling Capital. The investment firm whose building he drove past on Wentworth every morning, the one with the glass atrium and the lobby where you could see a live art installation that changed with the seasons. He'd heard the name on the radio once during a story about a commercial real estate deal that had reshuffled half the city's development plans. He thought vaguely that Sterling was probably a man. He was looking at her now for the first time, without the frame of crisis. She was around 30, he thought, though she held herself in a way that made the age difficult to pin. Dark hair pulled back with a few strands loose around her face from the struggle. The blazer was expensive. He didn't know much about women's clothing, but he could tell that much. There was a small abrasion on her left forearm, probably from the stone wall, and she was rubbing it absently with her thumb without seeming to know she was doing it. She caught him looking. He looked away. He had no business staring. "You're the one who stopped him." He turned back. She had crossed toward him, and the detective had let her go, which suggested she'd made a choice to come over rather than being sent. "I was parked there," Mason said, which wasn't really an answer. "I know. I saw your car." She stopped a few feet away, far enough to be polite, close enough for a real conversation. Up close, he could see that her eyes were brown and very direct, and that the steadiness in her voice extended to her expression in a way that seemed entirely genuine, not performed. "You didn't have to do that." "I didn't think about it," he said. "Not a heroic statement. I just mean, I didn't really think." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly. A smile would have been wrong for the moment. But a small acknowledgement, like she was noting something and filing it. "Your shoulder," she said. He realized he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body. "It's fine. You should have it looked at. I've had worse." That's not actually a reason not to have it looked at. He didn't have a good answer to that, so he didn't offer one. One of the patrol officers came over to let him know he could go. They had his contact information. They'd be in touch if they needed anything further. Mason nodded, looked once more at Amelia Sterling, and said, "I hope the rest of your night is quieter." It was a stupid thing to say. He knew it as soon as it left his mouth. But she said, "Thank you, Mason." And she said it in a way that made it clear she wasn't thanking him for the comment. She was thanking him for everything else. He drove home with his shoulder aching and his ears still ringing and the specific kind of tired that comes after adrenaline drains away, which is different from regular tired the way a drought is different from a dry afternoon. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Kellerman Street that had good bones and bad management. The elevator worked maybe 60% of the time. He took the stairs. His son was asleep. Dominic was 7 years old and slept like a person with complete confidence in the safety of the world. Flat on his back, arms out, the blanket kicked down to his ankles. Mason stood in the doorway and looked at him for a while. There was a glow-in-the-dark solar system on the ceiling that they'd put up together on a Saturday afternoon, Saturn slightly crooked because Mason had misjudged the placement and Dominic had insisted they leave it crooked because Saturn probably doesn't look perfect anyway, Dad. The logic had been sound. Mason showered, checked his shoulder in the bathroom mirror, bruised, possibly strained, nothing structural, and lay down on his bed in the dark. He thought about the gun going off. He thought about how fast it had all happened and how differently it could have ended. He thought about Amelia Sterling's hand shaking while her voice stayed level, and what kind of person managed that. He did not think he would hear from her again. He was wrong about that. The next morning played out the way mornings always did, which meant it played out at a pace and noise level that seemed designed by someone who hated him. Dominic was up at 6:15, loud from the moment he opened his eyes, needing breakfast and locating his soccer cleats and expressing strong opinions about whether he needed a jacket, given that it was, in his assessment, not even that cold. Mason made eggs because the pancake mix was almost gone, and he didn't want to open the last of it on a weekday. He drove Dominic to school, sat in the drop-off line for 9 minutes behind an SUV that refused to pull all the way forward, and watched his son disappear through the double doors without looking back, which was developmentally appropriate and still somehow managed to land somewhere between pride and loneliness. He picked up his phone in the parking lot. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. Chicago area code, no name, first call at 8:04 a.m. He hadn't heard it over the morning chaos. He called back. "Mr. Carter." The voice was female, professional, the kind of efficient warmth that people practice. "My name is Diana Reyes. I'm Ms. Sterling's executive assistant. Ms. Sterling would very much like to thank you personally for last night and is hoping you might be available for dinner this Saturday. She's aware this is short notice." Mason sat in the school parking lot with the engine running and thought about his Saturday. He had a transmission to worry about and a soccer game at 2 o'clock and a load of laundry that had been in the dryer for 3 days and technically, at this point, was just furniture. "What time?" he asked. 7 o'clock. She's made a reservation at Callaway's. He knew Callaway's by reputation, the kind of place where the menu didn't have prices. "Sure," he said. "Tell her I'll be there." He wasn't sure why he said yes. He told himself it was just dinner, just a thank you from someone with the resources to make elaborate gestures, nothing more. He told himself that on the drive home. He told himself that on Thursday when he got his shoulder looked at by a doctor who charged him a copay he didn't budget for, on Friday when he got a haircut for the first time in 6 weeks, on Saturday morning when he stood in his closet for an embarrassingly long time, looking at the 3 dress shirts he owned. He wore the navy one. Dominic, who was spending the night at Mason's neighbor Mrs. Petrakis's place, and was thrilled about it in the way 7-year-olds are thrilled about any deviation from normal routine, told him he looked like a guy in a commercial. Mason took this as positive. Callaway's was on the 15th floor of a building downtown, with windows that faced the lake and lighting that seemed designed to make everyone look slightly better than they actually were. The host recognized Mason's name and led him to a corner table where Amelia Sterling was already seated. And Mason's first thought was that she looked entirely different from 2 nights ago, in the way that a river looks different in daylight than in the dark. Same thing, but you could actually see it. She stood when he approached, which he hadn't expected. "You came," she said. "You invited me," he said. She almost smiled. "Fair enough." Dinner was not what Mason had braced for. He'd prepared himself for the particular discomfort of sitting across from someone who occupied a completely different tax bracket and was trying to be gracious about it. The careful way people spoke to him sometimes when they knew about his rideshare job, like they were handling something fragile. Amelia Sterling did not do that. She asked him questions and listened to the answers. She didn't perform interest, she was just interested. She asked about the Army. He told her. Not the full story, not the parts that didn't reduce well to dinner conversation, but the shape of it. 12 years. Military intelligence, then a shift to security operations. He'd come back from his last deployment when Dominic was 2 years old, his marriage already over in every way that mattered, though the paperwork took another 18 months. He didn't explain his ex-wife, and Amelia didn't ask. "Why rideshare?" she said. Not unkindly, just directly. "Flexible hours," he said. Dominic has soccer twice a week and I don't miss it. She considered this. What did you do between the army and the rideshare? Private security consulting. Couple of years. The contracts dried up and the overhead didn't. So you're overqualified for what you're doing. He looked at her across the table. She didn't say it like an insult. She said it like she was doing math out loud. Most people are overqualified for something, he said. She tilted her head slightly. My head of security retired 4 months ago. I've been using a contract firm in the interim, and it's been... She paused, choosing a word with the precision of someone who chose words carefully. Inadequate. Are you offering me a job? I'm having dinner with the man who saved my life, she said, and I'm noticing things. What kinds of things? The way you walked in here. You clocked every exit before you sat down. You positioned your chair so your back isn't to the room. You're wearing a watch that's probably military spec, but you chose not to make a statement with it. You ordered the third item on the menu without looking at the price because you didn't want to seem like you were looking at the prices. Mason was quiet for a moment. The watch was a gift, he said, and I ordered the salmon because I like salmon. I'm not criticizing, she said. I'm describing. He picked up his water glass and held it, and didn't say anything. The position would be head of security for Sterling Capital, she said. You'd oversee a team of 12, coordinate with our building management and our board on risk assessment, and report directly to me. The salary is... She named a number. Mason set down the water glass. That's more than I expected, he said. It reflects what the role requires, she said, and what the right person for it is worth. He thought about his $43 checking account. He thought about the transmission clicking. He thought about the glow-in-the-dark Saturn, slightly crooked on Dominic's ceiling, and Dominic's complete confidence in the safety of the world. I'd need to think about it, he said. Of course, she said. Take a week. They talked for another 2 hours. He learned that she had built Sterling Capital from a 2-person consulting shop in her mid-20s, that she'd had a business partner early on who had turned out to be neither of those things, that she worked 12-hour days as a baseline and didn't apologize for it, and also didn't expect it of the people around her. She grew up in a small city 3 hours north of Chicago, the daughter of a high school shop teacher and a woman who ran a bookkeeping service from the kitchen table. She'd earned a full academic scholarship to Northwestern and never gone back home to live, which she said without self-pity, but with the specific precision of someone who had thought about it for a long time. He noticed that she ate the entire meal rather than moving food around her plate, which he found unexpectedly reassuring. He noticed that when the waiter came, she thanked him every time, not performatively, just automatically, like it was built in. He noticed that when she talked about her company, her face changed. Not softer exactly, but more alive, the way people look when they're talking about something they built with their own hands and don't take for granted. You love it, he said. She paused. Is that surprising? People with that much money usually pretend they don't care about it anymore. The money isn't the thing I love, she said. The building is the thing I love. The company, what it does. She looked out at the lake, which at this hour was black and enormous and indifferent. When I started, I had 3 clients and a lease on office space I couldn't really afford. Now I have 400 employees and a portfolio that changed the economic trajectory of this neighborhood. She turned back to him. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It's not. The check came and she took it before he could do anything about it, which he suspected had been timed. Outside, waiting for their cars, the night air was cool and Lake Michigan was doing what it always did in September, which was making the city feel slightly smaller than it actually was. Amelia's driver pulled up first, a black sedan that appeared with the punctuality of something that had been circling the block. Think about the offer, she said. I will. She moved toward the car, then stopped. Mason, he looked at her. Thank you. For the other night. I know you said you didn't think about it, but I think about it. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and she got in the car, and the sedan moved into traffic, and Mason stood on the sidewalk in his navy shirt, feeling the specific cold of a Chicago September, and thinking about all the different versions of his life that were possible, and which ones he'd already chosen, and which ones still remained to be chosen. He called his sister from the car on the way home. Rachel picked up on the second ring, which meant she wasn't asleep. which meant she was either working late or watching the crime documentary series she claimed was research for her job as a social worker, but was clearly just something she liked. "Tell me something interesting," she said by way of greeting. "I got offered a job today," he said, "head of security at Sterling Capital." A pause. "The Sterling Capital? Amelia Sterling's company?" "You know it?" "Mason, everyone knows Sterling Capital. How did you—" "Wait." Another pause. "Was this the woman from the news this morning? The attempted robbery at the Meridian Grand? They didn't release her name, but they said a rideshare driver. Rachel. That was you. I drove past it the same day I applied to the security company and just happened to—" "Mason. What? That's not— Those aren't—" He heard her trying to decide which question to ask first. "Are you okay?" "My shoulder's a little stiff." "I don't mean your shoulder." He drove for a moment in silence. The city moved around him. Late traffic, a restaurant still lit, a group of people on a corner laughing about something. "I'm okay," he said. "And the job?" "It's a real offer. Good salary. Leadership role. Are you going to take it?" He thought about it. Not the logistics. The logistics were clear. The job made rational sense in every way he could measure it. He thought about the other part. The part he wasn't examining too closely yet. Amelia Sterling across the dinner table, talking about what she built, and the look on her face when she did. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." He got home at 10:52. Mrs. Petrakis had left a light on in the hallway, which she always did. He checked on Dominic through her partly open guest room door. The same sleeping position as always, the same absolute trust. He went back to his own apartment and sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on any lights. The apartment was 40 blocks from Sterling Capital's offices. He'd driven past the building so many times he could describe it from memory. He thought about working inside it. He thought about what Rachel would say if she knew the whole story, not just the job offer, but the dinner, and the way Amelia Sterling thanked the waiter every time, and the lake looking enormous and indifferent outside the windows. He was 32 years old. He'd been at war. He'd been a husband and stopped being one. He raised a kid who believed Saturn was probably imperfect and that this was fine. He'd made a lot of decisions in his life from a place of necessity, because necessity was what he usually had to work with. He called Diana Reyes's number the next morning and left a message saying he'd accept the position. He did not feel nervous about this. He felt nervous about everything else. His first week at Sterling Capital was an exercise in recalibration. The contrast with his previous life was not subtle. He went from a car that smelled like fast food and strangers to an office with a glass wall and a view of Wentworth Avenue. He went from checking a dispatch app on his phone to running morning briefings with a security team that had, in the 4 months since the previous head of security retired, developed a number of habits he needed to dismantle carefully and quickly. The team was 12 people. 3 were excellent. He identified them in the first 2 days by the way they asked questions rather than the answers they gave. 4 were adequate, trainable, worth the investment. 3 were coasting, and 2 were actively problematic in ways that hadn't been addressed because the contract firm overseeing them had no stake in addressing them. He didn't fire anyone in the first week. His father had told him once that you only got to fire someone once, so you should be sure. And his father had been right about that, even though he'd been wrong about most other things. He rebuilt the security protocols from scratch, starting with the building access logs, which revealed 4 anomalies in the past 6 weeks that nobody had flagged. The anomalies were small: a credential used twice in the same 15-minute window, a service entrance accessed at 2:30 a.m. on a Sunday by a maintenance badge that shouldn't have been active. But small anomalies were how you found big problems. And he filed each one and said nothing yet. He saw Amelia in the building every day, sometimes just in passing, an elevator, a hallway, and sometimes in structured settings, the morning briefings where he'd give her a security update and she'd listen with her full attention the way she did everything, not performing attention but actually giving it. She was clear and direct in the way that people are when they've spent enough time managing people to know that ambiguity costs everyone time they don't have. She didn't micromanage him. She'd hired him, and she let him work. He was careful. He was careful about what he noticed and what he didn't let himself notice, about maintaining a professional register in their interactions, about the line that existed between his role and hers, and why it existed and why he respected it. She was his employer. She had saved him from a specific version of his life that had been slowly running out of road. He was not in the habit of confusing gratitude with something else. Dominic, on the Saturday after his first week, asked if the new job was good. "Yeah," Mason said. "I think it's good." "Is your boss nice?" Mason considered this. "She's demanding," he said, "and she's fair, which is actually better than nice." Dominic thought about this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "My teacher is nice, but not fair," he said. "Dylan gets to go to the bathroom whenever he wants." "That does seem inequitable." "I don't know what that means, but yeah." They were at the kitchen table. Mason was making sandwiches and Dominic was drawing something on a notepad. It appeared to be a spaceship of some kind, elaborately detailed, with what might have been a solar system in the background. Saturn was in there. It was crooked. "Dad?" Dominic said. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" Mason stopped cutting. He looked at his son, who was still drawing, not looking up, asking the question with the complete casualness of someone who didn't fully understand the weight of it. "Working on it," Mason said. Dominic nodded, satisfied with this answer, and added another ring to his crooked Saturn. Outside, the city moved on. Somewhere downtown, the glass and steel building on Wentworth stood lit in the afternoon light, and in its security system, in the access logs Mason had been quietly reviewing, 4 small anomalies waited, patient and precise, for someone to understand what they were trying to say. He would understand. Soon. He just didn't know it yet. The 4 anomalies in the access logs did not go away on their own. Mason had learned early in his military career that small problems had a biological quality to them. Left alone, they didn't stay small. They fed on the gap between what people noticed and what they chose to address, and by the time they became visible to everyone, they had usually been growing for a long time in the dark. He kept the anomalies in a separate file on his personal laptop, not the company system, and added to it quietly, the way you'd tend something you weren't ready to show anyone yet. The second week brought 2 more entries. A vendor access card used on a floor it had no clearance for. A 30-minute gap in the stairwell camera feed on the 14th floor. Not a malfunction, because the camera's internal log showed it was powered and running. The footage had been deleted after the fact, selectively, by someone who knew where to look. He sat with that one for a long time. Deleting targeted footage required either administrative access to the security system or a very specific knowledge of its architecture. Both possibilities narrowed the field considerably. He didn't bring it to Amelia yet. He needed more before he brought it to anyone. What he did bring her, in their Friday morning briefing, was a revised security protocol for the executive floor, new credential cycling schedule, adjusted camera coverage angles, 2 additional checkpoints for after-hours building access. He walked her through it in 12 minutes, clear and methodical, the way he'd briefed officers in the field. She listened, asked 2 questions, both precise, both relevant, and approved all of it without hedging. "The camera coverage change on 14, she said, as he was gathering his notes. "That's not in the original proposal you submitted Monday." He looked up. She was watching him with that direct measuring quality she had, the one that made him feel like she was reading slightly ahead of whatever he was saying. "I found a gap in the existing coverage," he said. "I patched it." "What kind of gap?" He chose his words. "The kind that shouldn't exist in a building this size." She held his gaze for a moment. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "There are things I'm still verifying," he said. "When I have something concrete, you'll be the first person I come to." She didn't push him on it, which was either trust or strategy or both, and he wasn't sure yet which. The professional distance between them was something he maintained with deliberate effort, not because it was difficult in any painful way, but because he understood the geometry of it clearly. She was the reason he had this job, this stability, this version of his life that was measurably better than the one before it. Blurring that line was how you lost everything, and Mason Carter had lost enough already, but the distance had texture to it, which he noticed and chose not to examine too closely. There was the way she sometimes paused in the hallway when she passed him, not stopping exactly, just slowing, like she was deciding something. There was the fact that Diana Reyes had mentioned, with complete professional neutrality, that Ms. Sterling had declined 3 different firm candidates for his position before the dinner at Callaway's, which he didn't know what to do with. There was the morning 3 weeks into the job when he'd arrived at the office at 6:45 a.m. and found her already there, sitting at the conference table on the executive floor with a coffee going cold beside her and a financial report spread out in front of her. And she'd looked up and said, "You're early." And he'd said, "So are you." And she'd said, "I live closer," which was not an explanation for being in the office at 6:45 a.m., and they both knew it. He'd poured himself a coffee from the machine in the corner and asked if the report was the Harwick acquisition, because he'd heard it mentioned in passing, and it seemed like the kind of thing that would have someone in at 6:45. And she'd looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it and said, "Yes. How did you know about Harwick?" "I pay attention," he said. She'd looked at him for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "Apparently," she said. He took his coffee and went to his own office and didn't think about it for the rest of the morning, which required a low-level but consistent effort. What he thought about instead was the Harwick acquisition, because the name had appeared twice in the access logs he was building, not in the anomalies themselves, but in the metadata attached to certain files that had been accessed outside business hours. The Harwick deal was big. He pieced together the outlines of it from overheard conversations and the documents he legitimately had access to as head of security. A commercial real estate portfolio in the River North District, contested by at least 2 investment groups, with Sterling Capital holding the leading position in negotiations. The kind of deal that moved markets in measurable ways. The kind of deal that gave people who were losing it reasons to do things they otherwise wouldn't. He added a new section to his private file. The 4th week brought the first anonymous threat. It arrived as a physical note, actual paper, actual ink, slid under the door of Amelia's private office sometime between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Her assistant found it Wednesday morning and brought it directly to Mason rather than to Amelia, which told him Diana Reyes had more situational intelligence than her job title suggested. The note was short. 8 words printed in block letters from what was probably a standard laser printer. "Walk away from Harwick or lose more than the deal." Mason photographed it, bagged it, and had it to a contact at the Chicago PD he trusted, a detective named Paulson who'd been in homicide long enough to be unimpressed by most things, before noon. Then he went to Amelia's office and knocked on the open door. She was on a call. She held up one finger, finished the call in under 2 minutes, and looked at him with the expression of someone who has noticed from your posture that what's coming next requires their full attention. "Close the door," she said. He did. He sat down across from her and told her about the note. He didn't soften it. She was not someone who benefited from softened information, and treating her like she was would have been both condescending and counterproductive. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "You think it's connected to the robbery," she said. "I think it's worth assuming it is until I can prove otherwise. Harwick closes in 6 weeks. I know. I'm not walking away from it." He hadn't suggested she should. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm asking you to let me do my job." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite readable. Frustration, maybe, or something older than frustration. Something that had to do with the specific exhaustion of being someone who'd spent years making large decisions in environments that did not particularly account for her safety. "What does doing your job look like right now?" she asked. "It looks like you not changing your public schedule, not altering your behavior in any visible way, and trusting me to work the problem from the outside in. And if they escalate? Then I'll know sooner than they expected." He paused. "I need something from you, though." "What?" "I need the full list of everyone who lost a bid on Harwick. Not just the finalists. Everyone who was in the room at any point in the last 18 months. She didn't ask why. She told Diana to pull the records and have them to Mason by end of day. He was at the door when she said, "Mason." He turned. "The other night," she said, and then stopped, like she'd started a sentence in a direction she hadn't decided on yet. "The note. Diana brought it to you before she brought it to me." "Yes." "I'm not upset about that. I just want to know if you told her to." "No," he said. "That was her call." Amelia nodded slowly. She's a good judge of who to trust, she said. It was not entirely clear whether she was talking about Diana or herself. He went back to his office and sat with the list when it arrived. 41 names. He started narrowing it systematically, eliminating the ones who didn't have the resources for a sustained campaign, the ones whose professional reputations made this kind of risk irrational, the ones who'd already redirected their capital elsewhere. That left 11 names by Thursday evening. He ran them against the access log anomalies, against the timing of the surveillance gaps, against a database. His contact at the PD gave him access to informally and off the record. 3 names remained. One of them was a man named Gerald Voss. Voss ran a private equity firm called Pinnacle Group out of a building 4 blocks from Sterling Capital. He was 54 years old, had been in Chicago commercial real estate for 26 years, and had a reputation in the industry for winning acquisitions by attrition, wearing down competitors through legal delays, regulatory challenges, and the occasional aggressive play that walked right up to the line without technically crossing it. He'd been a front-runner for Harwick 18 months ago, before Sterling Capital had restructured its bid in a way that made Voss's position mathematically untenable. He'd withdrawn publicly with a brief statement that used the word congratulations in a way that had the structural form of congratulations while communicating something else entirely. Mason found 3 other connections. A security consultant who'd been dismissed from Pinnacle Group 6 months ago had a brother-in-law who'd worked building maintenance at the Meridian Grand for 2 years before quietly leaving 2 weeks after the robbery attempt. A shell company registered in Delaware had leased a vehicle that appeared twice in the area around Sterling Capital's building on the nights corresponding to the stairwell camera gap. And Voss had dinner with his CFO the night before the note appeared, at a restaurant 3 blocks from the Meridian Grand. None of it was proof. It was the shape of proof. The way you could see a figure in a dark room, not because you saw them, but because of where the darkness was denser. He briefed Paulson on a Thursday night at a bar on Michigan Avenue that neither of them had been to before, which was the kind of operational instinct Mason had maintained since the Army and saw no reason to abandon. Paulson was a heavy-set man in his early 50s with the specific kind of patience that came from having conducted hundreds of interviews with people who were lying to him. He listened to everything Mason laid out, drank half a beer, and said, "You've got a pattern, not a case." "I know. I can start a formal inquiry, but without more I'm not asking for a formal inquiry yet. I'm asking you to be ready to move when I give you something harder." Paulson looked at him. "How are you planning to get something harder?" "The same way I always did," Mason said. "I'm going to wait for them to make the next move. That's a risk." "Everything is a risk. I'd rather control the conditions." Paulson finished his beer and said he'd be available. Mason drove home that night thinking about conditions, about how much of military intelligence was simply about creating the environment where the other side felt safe enough to make the mistake that exposed them. He'd been good at that, not the aggressive part, not the breach and clear part that people made movies about, but the patient part, the reading the room part, the understanding that most people eventually told you what they were doing if you gave them long enough and a reason to feel unobserved. Dominic was still awake when he got home, which was technically past bedtime, but not by a scandalous amount. He was at the kitchen table with a library book about the solar system, which Mason found both touching and slightly suspicious, given that homework had never generated this level of enthusiasm. "Dad," Dominic said, without looking up from the book, "did you know Saturn's rings are made of ice and rocks?" "I did know that." "How big are they?" "The rings? Enormous, but very thin." Dominic considered this. "That's kind of weird, like a big hula hoop." "Kind of exactly like that, yes." Dominic turned a page. "Is everything okay at your job?" Mason sat down across from him. His son was 7 years old and had his mother's eyes and the specific perceptiveness that children develop when they've grown up in a household where one parent is frequently somewhere else in their mind, even when physically present. Mason had worked hard on that, was still working on it. "Yeah," he said. "Why?" Dominic shrugged with the elaborate casualness that meant he'd been thinking about it. "You look like you're thinking about something when you don't think anyone's watching." Mason looked at his son for a moment. "Smart kid," he said. "Mrs. Petrakis says so too." "Mrs. Petrakis is right." He reached across the table and turned the book so he could see the diagram of Saturn's ring system. I'm working on a problem at the job. It's a complicated one, but I've got it. Dominic studied him. The assessment was genuine and not brief. Okay, he said finally, apparently satisfied, and turned the book back and went on reading. Mason made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, which he did more often than he sat at the table, which was a habit Rachel had told him he needed to fix, but which he hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. He thought about Amelia in her office at 6:45 a.m. with the cold coffee. He thought about the way she'd said, "I'm not walking away from it," with a flatness in her voice that wasn't defiance exactly, more like the statement of a fact so settled it didn't require emphasis. He thought about Gerald Voss and the shape of a case that wasn't yet a case. He slept 5 hours and was back at the building by 6:30. The next 3 weeks moved in a rhythm that felt deceptively normal from the outside. Mason ran his team, cycled the credentials, reviewed the logs, and made sure that nothing about his investigation was visible in his public behavior. He was courteous at the morning briefings, thorough in his reports, available when Amelia needed him, and careful, always careful, about the distance. But the distance was getting harder to maintain with quite the same clean edges, and he was honest enough with himself to notice that without being sure what to do about it. It happened in small increments. An evening in the 5th week where a board presentation ran long and most of the executive floor had cleared out, and Amelia came to his office doorway at 8:30 p.m. and said, "Have you eaten?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Neither have I." And they'd ended up eating takeout Thai food at the conference table while she walked him through the Harwick timeline in more detail than she'd shared with him before, not because it was operationally necessary, but because she was, he understood this gradually, simply talking to him. The way you talk to someone you'd started trusting in the specific way that didn't have a category yet. He found out that night that she didn't like cilantro, which she picked out of her noodles with focused precision, and that she'd taught herself to play chess from a book when she was 12 because there was nobody in her house who played, and that she had a younger brother she didn't speak to because of something that had happened with their mother's estate after she died 4 years ago, and that she'd cried exactly once about the robbery at the Meridian Grand. Not that night, but 3 days later, alone in her apartment, which she mentioned with the precision of someone reporting a fact rather than confiding one. "Why are you telling me that?" he asked. She looked at her noodles. "I don't know," she said. "I usually don't tell people things I don't know the reason for." "Maybe that's the reason," he said. "Maybe that's exactly the reason." She looked up at him. He held her gaze and then looked away, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it wasn't, and that was the part that required management. On the drive home, he turned the radio on loud enough to make thinking difficult, which worked for about 6 blocks. Rachel called on Sunday, and he told her more than he'd intended to. Not about the investigation, which he kept compartmentalized, but about the Thai food and the chess book and the look on Amelia's face when she talked about what she'd built. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Mason," she said. "Don't." "I haven't said anything." "You were going to say something that starts with, 'She's your employer.'" "I was going to say you sound like someone who's actually happy for the first time in 3 years, and I don't want you to talk yourself out of it with a bunch of lines you drew before you knew what you were drawing around." He drove. The Sunday street was quiet. "It's not that simple," he said. "It never is," Rachel said. "That's not actually the argument you think it is." He didn't have a response to that. The next threat came on a Tuesday, the last day of October, and it was not a note. Mason's phone rang at 7:14 a.m., not his personal number, but the building's security line, which routed to him first. The caller didn't identify themselves. The voice was male, middle register, deliberately modulated in the way that people spoke when they were trying to sound untraceable. "Tell your boss," the voice said, "that the Harwick deal has consequences she hasn't priced in yet." "Who is this?" Mason said. "Someone doing you a favor by calling instead of not calling." A pause. "She should think about what she values most. Deals come and go. Some things don't come back." The line went dead. Mason sat with the phone for exactly 4 seconds. Then he called Paulson, texted his 3 best team members to convene in his office in 10 minutes, and walked down the hall to Amelia's office. She was already in. She was always already in. He closed the door, sat down, and told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he watched something move across her face that she didn't bother controlling. A flash of something that was not fear, but was in the same neighborhood. Something that was about being targeted, which was a specific feeling that had nothing to do with physical courage and everything to do with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had decided you were the problem they needed to solve. They called the building line, she said. Yes. Not my personal number, not the board line, the building security line. They wanted me to hear it, Mason said. Not you. They know I'm running this now, and they want me to know they're watching the building's communications. She absorbed this. That means they have access to our directory. Or they've been watching long enough to know which line routes to me first. He paused. Either way, this is the second move. First the note, now this. They're escalating. What's the next move after this? He thought about Paulson's pattern, not a case comment. He thought about Voss. He thought about the shell company car. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'm close to knowing. She nodded. She looked at him directly, without the management layer, the professional frame. Just looked at him. Are you okay? She asked. He blinked. I'm fine. You're the one being threatened. You're the one who has to stand between the threat and me, she said. That's not nothing. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he usually did when he didn't know what to do with something. He set it aside neatly to be examined later and focused on what was in front of him. I need you to do something for me, he said. What? For the next 2 weeks, vary your routes. Don't take the same car 2 days in a row. Let me schedule your building arrivals so they're not predictable. She didn't fight him on it. She agreed, went through the logistics with him for 20 minutes, and then said, I have a 9 a.m. with the Harwick attorneys. I'm still taking it. I know, he said. I'll have someone outside the door. That's not necessary. Amelia. He said her name with the weight of his professional authority and not a single ounce more than that. Let me do my job. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said okay, in the way she said things when she'd decided they were true. He stood. He was at the door when she said quietly, Mason. He turned. Thank you, she said, and I don't just mean for this. He understood that she still meant it the same way she'd meant it outside the Meridian Grand. The original thing, the thing that had started all of this. The $43 checking account version of his life and the choice he'd made without thinking on a dark street outside a hotel that was better than everything around it. You don't have to keep thanking me, he said. I know, she said. I do it anyway. He went back down the hall to his team. Outside the building, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning. Traffic, pedestrians, the river catching the November light. Somewhere in it, Gerald Voss was sitting in a building 4 blocks away, and the shape of a case that wasn't yet a case was tightening into something that might, with the right next move, become one. Mason Carter sat down with his team and his files and the patience he'd spent 12 years building and got back to work. The next 2 weeks moved the way dangerous things sometimes did. Quietly, with the surface calm of a river that was doing something complicated underneath. Mason varied Amelia's schedule the way he'd promised. Different vehicles, staggered arrival times, rotated parking access points. He did it without making it feel like a siege, which was the harder part of the work. Keeping someone functional and unparanoid while building a wall around them that they couldn't fully see. Amelia cooperated without complaint, which he appreciated, and without pretending it wasn't happening, which he appreciated more. His team had tightened up in the weeks since he'd arrived. The 3 who were excellent had become better, given clear direction and the understanding that their judgment was trusted when it was sound. 2 of the coasters had found their footing once expectations were explicit and consequences were real. The 2 problematic ones had been given structured improvement plans that both of them knew were also documented records of their failure to improve, and one of them had already started quietly interviewing elsewhere, which resolved the problem with minimum friction. He still hadn't told his team about the private file. That file now ran to 23 pages. He'd been building it with the same methodical patience he'd once applied to intelligence packages in the field. layering information, cross-referencing timelines, never committing to a conclusion before the evidence supported it. The shape of Gerald Voss kept emerging from the data the way a face sometimes emerged from static. Not because you were looking for it, but because it was there, and eventually the pattern was undeniable. The shell company vehicle, a black Chevy Tahoe registered to a Delaware LLC called Bridgeton Consulting, which had no web presence and no listed employees, had appeared on surveillance footage from a camera across the street from the building on 3 separate occasions. Mason had pulled the footage through a contact at the city's traffic management office, another relationship from his Army days that he'd maintained with the low-key intentionality of someone who understood that networks were infrastructure. The Tahoe parked, sat for between 40 minutes and 2 hours, and left. The windows were tinted beyond legal limit. He had a partial plate. He ran the plate through Paulson, who ran it through channels Mason didn't have direct access to, and called him back on a Thursday evening with a tone in his voice that was different from his usual flat delivery. The LLC traces back through 2 holding companies, Paulson said. Takes a while to unravel, but the third company in the chain, registered in Nevada, 2019, has a registered agent who also handles incorporation work for Pinnacle Group. Mason was quiet for a moment. That's a thread, he said. It's a thread, Paulson agreed. Not a rope. Not yet. How long to build it into something harder? Depends on how patient you are. I'm patient, Mason said. The question is whether they are. After he hung up, he sat in his car in the building's parking structure for a few minutes. November had fully arrived now, and the structure was cold in the specific way of concrete spaces in winter, the cold that came up through the floor. He thought about the phone call to the security line. They wanted me to hear it, he told Amelia, and that was true, but there was a second layer he hadn't said out loud yet. Whoever made that call had wanted him to know they knew about him. Not just that security had been reinforced, that specifically Mason Carter was running it, which meant someone had been watching the building long enough and closely enough to identify him by name or by role or by both. That was not a small thing. He went upstairs and worked until 9. The first week of November brought a development he hadn't anticipated, which was that Dominic asked about Amelia. It came out of nowhere, the way things did with 7-year-olds, in the middle of a Saturday morning at the kitchen table over cereal. Dominic had a soccer game at 2 and was already wearing his shin guards because he'd put them on at 8 a.m. out of enthusiasm, and Mason hadn't had the energy to explain why that was unnecessary. Is your boss the one who got robbed? Dominic asked. Mason set down his coffee. Where did you hear that? Mrs. Petrakis. She showed me an article on her phone. There was a picture of a building. What article? Something about a company. It said the CEO had been in a robbery attempt. And you work at a company. Dominic ate a spoonful of cereal with the complete focus of someone building to a point. And then I remembered you said your boss is demanding and fair, so I thought probably it was the same person. Mason looked at his son and thought, not for the first time, that he was going to have a very difficult time lying to this child as he got older. Yes, he said. My boss is the person who was in the robbery. Dominic chewed. Is she okay? She's fine. Were you scared when you helped her? He thought about it honestly. I didn't have time to be scared, he said. It was over fast. I was scared after. Dominic seemed to find this satisfying, the after part specifically. Mrs. Petrakis says you're a hero, he said. Mrs. Petrakis is generous. What does generous mean? Kind in how she sees things. Dominic considered this. Can I meet her sometime? Your boss? Mason picked up his coffee and found it had gone cold. Maybe, he said. Eat your cereal. He thought about that question more than he wanted to that day, through the soccer game, which Dominic's team lost 4-2, but which Dominic himself played with the particular reckless commitment that Mason both recognized and found complicated to watch. Through the drive home and the post-game review that Dominic insisted on conducting with the seriousness of a professional athlete, even though he was 7. Through the evening, when Dominic fell asleep in front of a movie he was technically old enough to stay up for, and Mason sat on the couch next to him in the dark for a while before carrying him to bed. Can I meet her sometime? The question assumed something Mason hadn't permitted himself to assume, and the fact that his 7-year-old was already ahead of him on it was either funny or alarming, and he couldn't decide which. The break in the case came from a direction he hadn't expected, which was how breaks usually came. One of his 3 excellent team members was a woman named Keisha Tran, 29 years old, former Chicago PD, precise and largely humorless in a way that Mason respected, because it meant she applied the same standard to everything. She handled after-hours security reviews and had developed, on her own initiative, a habit of cross-referencing visitor logs against maintenance schedules, looking for the kind of quiet overlap that shouldn't exist. She knocked on Mason's office door on a Monday morning, second week of November, and put a printed log on his desk without preamble. "Look at the vendor access column," she said. He looked. A IT vendor badge, registered to a company called Novatech Solutions for routine equipment maintenance, had been used 6 times in the past 8 weeks. Once on a legitimate maintenance visit with sign-in and verification. 5 times outside business hours, at intervals that were irregular enough to avoid pattern detection unless you were specifically looking. "Novatech," Mason said. "Legit company," Keisha said. "Small, 4 employees, mostly commercial clients. But the employee registered to this badge? Quit Novatech 3 weeks ago. The badge was never deactivated." Mason looked at the log. The badge had been used 2 days after the employee's termination. "Someone kept the badge," he said, "or was given access to it." He picked up the log. 5 unauthorized building entries. The timing of 3 of them corresponded exactly with the nights he'd flagged in his private file: the stairwell camera gap, the credential used on the wrong floor, and one other anomaly he'd cataloged but not yet explained. The explanation was standing right here on this page. "Good work," he said. Keisha nodded, accepting the compliment without performance. "I pulled the building entry points for each date," she said. "Service entrance on Michigan every time. No camera on that door between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. because the coverage was redesigned 3 years ago and never updated for the new entrance position." "There's a camera now," Mason said. He'd added it in week 2. "Yeah. Last entry was the week before you added it." He sat back. "They stopped the night I closed the gap. They're watching the building actively," he said. "Not just surveilling from outside, they're monitoring our internal changes." Keisha was quiet for a beat. "Is that a we have a mole situation?" "I don't know yet. Could be the camera coverage. If they had access to the security system, they could see what changed. Could be a human source." He paused. "Don't share this with the team yet." She nodded. She trusted the instruction without needing the explanation, which was why she was in the excellent category. After she left, Mason sat with the log for a long time. Then he opened his private file and started building the next layer. By Friday, he had identified the Novatech badge's final entry point, a utility corridor on the 12th floor that housed, among other things, the company's server room annex. He pulled the server room access logs and found what he'd been afraid he would find: 3 instances of a maintenance terminal being accessed during unauthorized hours. The terminal had local read permissions for file directories that included deal documentation for active acquisitions, including Harwick. Someone had been reading Sterling Capital's acquisition files from the inside. He called Paulson at noon on Friday. "I need a favor," he said. "Forensic IT. Someone I can trust to work this quietly." Paulson gave him a name without asking for context, which was why Mason trusted him. The forensic contact, a woman named Carol Yun, who worked independently and billed at a rate that made Mason's eyes water briefly, came in over the weekend as a contracted IT consultant, which was a legitimate cover because the company used outside contractors regularly. She worked the server room for 6 hours on Saturday and called Mason at 9 p.m. "Whoever was in here knew what they were doing," she said. "They didn't take anything. They copied. Read-only access, targeted file pulls, the Harwick directory, the Meridian Holdings directory, 3 others." A pause. "They also left something." "What kind of something?" "A listener. A passive monitoring script embedded in a maintenance log file that most systems auto-generate and most people never look at. It's been active for 6 weeks. Mason was quiet. "It's dormant right now," Carol said. "It's not transmitting, just logging. Whatever they were waiting for, some trigger condition, hasn't happened yet." He thought about what that trigger might be. He thought about the Harwick closing date, which was now less than 3 weeks away. Can you pull it without letting them know it's been found? I can make it look like a system routine ran over it. Standard cleanup. It'll stop logging without any alert on their end. Do that, he said. And Carol, I need everything it's captured. 6 weeks of logs. She told him she could have it by Monday morning. He drove home with his hands tight on the wheel. The listener script changed the picture significantly. This wasn't just a competitor making threats to pressure a deal. Someone had invested real technical resources, real operational planning, real ongoing access. That was organized in a way that went well beyond a rattled businessman hiring a few criminals to rough up an executive. This had infrastructure. This had funding. This had patience. He thought about the robbery, the masked man at the Meridian Grand, the gun, the $43 checking account version of his life. He'd thought it was opportunistic. He'd stopped thinking that weeks ago. But seeing the listener's script, knowing that someone had been embedded in this company's systems while Mason was still driving a rideshare with a clicking transmission, made the timeline snap into focus in a different way. They'd been planning this long before the robbery. The robbery wasn't the main event. It was a message. It was Voss making sure Amelia knew she was exposed, that her life was precarious, that walking away from Harwick had a personal dimension, not just a financial one. And then Mason had intervened, and the message had failed to arrive. So they'd escalated to the note. Then the phone call. And all along, the listener had been sitting in the server room, collecting everything, waiting for the moment before closing when the information would be most valuable, either to sell or to use as leverage, or to give Voss a structural advantage in making a last-minute challenge to the acquisition. He sat in his car in the parking lot of his building on Kellerman Street and thought about all of this until the cold got through the windows and his breath was visible. Then he went inside and knocked on Mrs. Petrakis's door. She opened it in her robe, unsurprised, because she was almost never surprised by anything. "He's fine," she said, before he asked. "He went to sleep at 8:30. The movie was too slow for him." "Thank you," Mason said. "I'm sorry I'm late." She looked at him with the specific perception of a woman in her 70s who had outlived 2 husbands and raised 4 children and had approximately 0 patience for people who pretended they were fine when they weren't. "Come in," she said. "I have tea." He sat at her kitchen table, which was covered in a plastic floral tablecloth and smelled like baked bread, and drank tea that was stronger than he usually took it, and let her talk for a while about her grandson's football game and the building's boiler problem, and a neighbor on the 2nd floor who played music at 11 p.m. on weeknights. He said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments, and somewhere in the middle of it, the tightness in his chest loosened a small degree, the way it sometimes did when normal life was present enough to compete with the other thing. "You're working on something difficult," she said when she'd wound down. "Yes." "Dangerous?" He considered. "Possibly. Not imminently." She poured more tea into his cup without asking. "That woman," she said. "The one from the news. Dominic said you work for her." "I do." Mrs. Petrakis made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He asks about her sometimes," she said. "Just curious." Mason looked at his cup. "I know." "He doesn't have a lot of women in his life," she said. "Just me and Rachel. And I'm old and Rachel lives in Evanston." "I know," Mason said again. "I'm not telling you anything," she said. "I'm just saying what is." He walked back to his apartment at 10:30 and stood in Dominic's doorway for a moment. The glow-in-the-dark solar system was doing its quiet thing on the ceiling. Crooked Saturn. The absolute trust of a sleeping kid. He didn't sleep much. He was used to that. Monday brought Carol Yoon's report on the listener logs, and the logs were worse than he'd hoped and better than he'd feared. Worse because the scope of what had been accessed was significant. Not just Harwick documents, but correspondence between Amelia and her legal team, internal memos about the Meridian Holdings dispute, a board strategy document that had no business being read by anyone outside the company. Better because the logs also captured the script's own network activity, including, faintly, partially, but readable to Carol's trained eye, the IP routing pattern used when it had briefly pinged its origin server during installation. The origin was obscured through several proxies, but the final visible node in the chain was a commercial data center in a building on North Wacker Drive. Pinnacle Group's server infrastructure was hosted at a commercial data center on North Wacker Drive. He called Paulson. "I have the rope now," he said. Paulson was quiet for a moment on the other end. "I'm going to need to bring in the cybercrime unit." "I know, but carefully. If Voss gets word that we're moving before we're ready to move, he'll sanitize everything and we lose it." "Understood. Give me 48 hours to set up the right approach." "You have 36, Mason said. "The Harwick closing is in 18 days. If he's planning a move on the data, it'll happen before then." 36, Paulson agreed, and Mason could hear in his voice the shift from routine to operational, the specific register change of a person who had just decided to take something seriously. He had one more thing to do before he could take this to the next level. He needed to tell Amelia. Not everything. Not yet. Not until Paulson's unit was positioned and the risk of information getting back to Voss was minimized. But enough. She deserved to understand the shape of what had been done to her company, to her. She was not someone you protected by keeping in the dark. She was someone you protected by telling her the truth and trusting her to handle it. He asked Diana to clear 30 minutes on Amelia's calendar at 4 p.m. and said it was a security briefing. When he walked into her office, she was on the phone, finished it in under a minute. He was learning that she always finished quickly when she knew he was waiting, that his time was one of the things she didn't waste, and gave him her full attention before he'd even sat down. He told her about the listener script. He told her about the file access. He told her about the IP routing and the North Wacker data center and the connection to Pinnacle Group. He told her about the Novatech badge and the Shell Company vehicle and the thread from the Delaware LLC to Voss's registered agent. He told her everything except his last step, which was already in motion. She was very still while he talked. He watched her absorb it, process it, move through the stages that people move through when they learned they'd been violated in a sustained and deliberate way. Not just threatened, not just targeted, but infiltrated, watched, read for weeks. Her hands were flat on the desk and very still. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough to be real. 6 weeks, she said. They've been in our systems for 6 weeks. At least. While we were working on Harwick, while I was in this building every day. She stopped. Yes. She looked out the window. The November city sat outside, gray and enormous and indifferent. He could see the tension in her jaw and the control she was applying to keep her voice level, and for a moment the professional distance reduced to nothing. Not because anything changed between them, but because something about watching someone fight to stay composed when they'd just been told their private world had been read by a hostile stranger made all the careful geometry irrelevant. "Amelia," he said. She looked back at him. "I'm going to end this," he said, not as a promise to comfort her, as a statement of operational fact, delivered with the same flat certainty he'd used his entire career to communicate things that needed to be believed. She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but the thing she'd been holding against the outside managed to get through in one place. "I know," she said. The 36 hours after that were the kind that Mason had spent years learning to navigate. The specific suspended quality of time when everything was in motion but nothing was yet resolved, when the work was done and the outcome was not yet known, and the only thing left was to hold the position and wait. He briefed his 3 core team members on the access breach without naming Voss. Operational need to know, he'd explain the rest when he could. He coordinated with Carol Yun to have documentation ready. He answered Paulson's questions when they came in, which was several times over the following day, and each answer brought the net a little tighter. He went home both nights at a reasonable hour, which he almost never did. He cooked dinner both nights, actual dinner, not sandwiches, because Dominic had mentioned twice that week that Mrs. Petrakis always made real food, and Mason had interpreted this as the gentle critique it was. He helped with homework, a reading assignment, and a worksheet about multiplication that Dominic approached with aggressive disinterest until Mason reframed it as a logistics problem, which caught his attention. "If your soccer team needs to carry 10 water bottles and each kid can carry 2, Mason said, how many kids do you need?" Dominic sat up straighter. 5. "Right, that's 5 times 2 equals 10. Dominic looked at the worksheet. This is the same thing, he said, with the dawning expression of someone who had been mildly deceived in a way they couldn't object to. Exactly the same thing, Mason said. You tricked me. I helped you. Dominic thought about this distinction for a moment, and then appeared to accept it and finished the worksheet in under 10 minutes. On the second night, Wednesday, while Dominic slept, Mason sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his private file and spent 2 hours going through everything one more time. Every entry, every connection, every thread. He was looking for what he'd missed, what he'd assumed, where the logic had a gap. His father's other useful piece of advice, that you only got to be surprised once, and after that it wasn't surprise anymore, it was failure, had stayed with him longer than most things from that quarter. He didn't find any gaps. The case was as solid as he could make it with what he had. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a while. The building made its building sounds around him. The pipes, the elevator, the woman upstairs who walked around in hard shoes at odd hours. Normal sounds. The sounds of a life that was entirely different from where he'd been a year ago, 2 years ago, when he was reading contracts on a laptop at the same table, 3 failed bids in a row, the transmission on the first rideshare car clicking over 60 miles an hour. He thought about Amelia's hands flat on the desk, the control in her face. I know. He thought about Dominic asking, "Can I meet her sometime?" He thought about a lot of things he was not yet ready to do anything about. Thursday morning, Paulson called at 7:42. "We're ready," he said. "Cybercrime is positioned. We need one more piece, a formal authorization from Sterling Capital to examine the server room breach as a criminal matter. We need that on paper from the company's legal counsel by end of day." Mason called Diana. Diana had Amelia's in-house counsel on the line within 20 minutes. By noon, the authorization was drafted, reviewed, and signed. At 2 p.m., a cybercrime unit was on site in the server room with Carol Yoon walking them through the listener script and the access logs and the IP chain. At 4 p.m., Paulson called again. "The data center on North Wacker. We have a warrant." Mason was sitting at his desk. He looked out his glass wall at the open floor of the security suite, at Keisha running a log review, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon business of protecting a place that mattered. "How fast can you move?" he said. "Fast," Paulson said. "End of day today, or first thing tomorrow. Depends on what we find at the data center." "Move tonight," Mason said. "Harwick closing is in 16 days. Don't give him 16 days." Paulson moved that night. Mason didn't sleep much. He stayed in the office until almost midnight, which he told himself was professional necessity and which was also just the particular inability to be anywhere else when something you'd built over 8 weeks was reaching its resolution. Keisha stayed too, which he hadn't asked her to do, and he appreciated it without saying so, and she seemed to prefer it that way. At 11:47, his phone rang. Paulson. "We've got him," he said. Mason set down the coffee he'd been holding. The floor was very quiet. Through the glass wall, Keisha looked up, and he met her eyes and gave a single nod. "Tell me," he said. "The data center access logs confirm the connection to Pinnacle Group's infrastructure. We also found a contract, encrypted, but our unit cracked it inside 3 hours. A service agreement between a shell company tied to Voss and a private intelligence firm that specializes in corporate espionage. The firm contracted the robbery attempt, the Novatech badge, the listener script." Paulson paused. "And a communication from Voss himself, email from a personal account, not the company system, which means he thought it was safe, instructing the intelligence firm to escalate pressure if the note and the phone call didn't produce results." Mason was quiet for a moment. What did escalate mean in the email? He didn't specify. That's going to be a question for his defense attorney. Another pause. "We're picking him up tonight. His attorney is going to try to pull it apart, but the documentation is clean." "Good," Mason said. "Carter." "Yeah." "You built this right," Paulson said. "Took longer than most people would have been patient for." Mason looked out at the empty floor. "I had something worth protecting," he said. He meant the company. That was true. He meant other things too, which he was not going to say to Paulson at midnight on a Thursday. He texted Amelia. Not a call, she might be asleep, and this could wait until she was in front of him. Just 4 words. "He has been arrested." Her response came in 40 seconds. Come to my office tomorrow at 8. And Mason, thank you. He put the phone in his pocket and looked out the window at the November city, lit and moving and indifferent in the way that cities always are to the specific weight of what happens inside them. Somewhere 4 blocks away, Gerald Voss was being put in a car. The Harwick deal was 16 days from closing. The listener was gone. The gaps were closed. He drove home with the radio off, which was new, and thought about nothing in particular, which was also new. And for the first time in 8 weeks, something in the back of his shoulders released a fraction of the tension it had been carrying. Just a fraction. The way things loosen when the immediate danger has passed, but the full weight of everything still waits to be sorted through. He checked on Dominic. Same position, same absolute trust. He went to bed and slept 6 hours without interruption, which was the best night he'd had in 2 months. He was at the building by 7:45. He didn't know why he was early, some residual operational habit, the need to be in the space before the conversation happened, to have the room already settled around him. Diana wasn't in yet. The executive floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that large offices had before 8 a.m. when the ventilation was running and the lights were on, but no one had disturbed the air. He poured coffee from the machine in the corner kitchen and stood at the window looking at Wentworth Avenue. The city was doing what it always did at this hour, moving in the functional, unsentimental way of a place that had no opinion about what had happened the night before. Traffic on Wentworth. A delivery truck double-parked outside the building across the street. A woman walking a dog that didn't want to be walked, the leash taut and diagonal. Normal Thursday morning, the day after Gerald Voss had been put in a car. He heard Amelia before he saw her. The particular sound of her heels on the hallway floor, which he had learned without intending to, the rhythm of it, the pace. She came in at 2 minutes past 8. She was in a dark coat she hadn't taken off yet, and her hair was down, which was unusual. He'd seen it down twice before. Both times early morning, when she'd arrived before the day had required her to fully assemble herself. She stopped when she saw him. "You're already here," she said. "I'm always early," he said. "I know." She came to the window and stood beside him, not right beside him, but close enough that the city outside was the same view for both of them. She didn't take off the coat. She looked at the street for a moment. "Tell me everything." He told her. Not the version he'd have given a board report, not the structured professional briefing with the supporting documentation organized by date. He told her the whole thing the way it had actually happened. The access logs in the beginning, Keisha and the Novatech badge, Carol Yoon working the server room on a Saturday, Paulson and the data center on North Wacker, the email from Voss's personal account that had been the last piece of the structure, the thing that connected intention to action in a way that documentation could support. She listened without interrupting. He'd noticed over the weeks that this was one of her consistent qualities, the ability to receive information without layering her reaction on top of it in real time, to wait until she had the whole thing before she did anything with it. Most people couldn't do that. They responded to pieces while you were still delivering the rest. When he finished, she turned from the window. "The robbery was never random," she said. "No. He hired those men. The contract links the private intelligence firm to the robbery attempt. The legal chain between the firm and Voss will take time to argue in court, but the documentation makes it survivable. Paulson's confident." She absorbed this. Her jaw was doing the thing it did. The small tension, the control. "He could have just come back with a better offer on Harwick," she said. "That's what people do. They come back." "Some people don't like losing," Mason said. "And some people who don't like losing have more resources than sense." She almost made a sound that would have been a laugh in a different moment. "That's a generous way to frame a man who hired criminals to intimidate me into a business decision. I'm a generous person." This time she did make the sound, brief and real. Then it passed, and the weight came back to her face. "How much do they have on him? Be honest." "Enough to charge. Enough to make his lawyers nervous. Whether it becomes a conviction depends on things outside my control. How well the private intelligence firm cooperates, how clean their documentation is, whether Voss has political cover that gets quietly applied." He paused. "But at minimum, he's finished professionally. Even if his lawyers find a crack, the email exists." The contract exists. The data center logs exist. That's not something you rebuild from. She nodded slowly. She walked to the conference table and sat down, and for the first time since she'd come in, she looked tired. Not dramatically, just the specific, visible weight of someone who had been running on compressed energy for weeks and had just been told they were allowed to stop. 6 weeks, she said quietly. Not to him exactly, to the space. At least, he said. 6 weeks of sitting in that chair. She stopped. I should have known something was wrong earlier. The note came in and I kept thinking it was posturing, that it would stop. People had made threats before, and they'd always been posturing. You had no reason to know this was different, Mason said. I hired a head of security, she said. I should have given you more to work with sooner. You gave me everything I needed. Mason. She looked at him directly. I didn't tell you about the Harwick rivals in detail until you asked. I should have put it in front of you the first week. He sat down across the table from her. The coffee was going cold and he didn't care. You were running a billion-dollar acquisition while managing a threat campaign without showing your investors any sign that there was a threat campaign, he said. You were doing 2 jobs simultaneously. That's not a failure. It's not a success either. No, he agreed. It's just what happened. He held her gaze. You can't go back and tell yourself things you didn't know. That's not how it works. She was quiet for a moment. You're different than I expected, she said. What did you expect? She thought about it. Someone more tactical. Someone who would present the case clearly and then wait for direction. I can do that? I know you can, she said. You just also do this. What's this? She made a small gesture, vague, which was unusual for her. She was normally precise with her language and her movements. Say the thing that's true instead of the thing that's professionally appropriate. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window now at an angle, the specific gray gold of a November Chicago morning, and it made the room look honest in the way that early light sometimes did, stripped of the artificial brightness of the workday. I can stop doing that if it's a problem, he said. I didn't say it was a problem, she said. They sat with that for a moment. The ventilation ran. Below on Wentworth, a bus went past. I should call my legal team, she said. And the board will need a briefing today. The story is going to be in the news by this afternoon. Paulson said as much. He did. I'd recommend getting ahead of it with a statement. Control the narrative from the company's side before the press builds their own. I know. She stood. She was back in the professional register, the day already organizing itself in her mind. He could see it. She had a board briefing and a media statement and a legal call and the Harwick closing still 16 days out, and she was moving toward all of it with the same relentless capability she brought to everything. Mason, he stood. I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it without deflecting it into professional language. He waited. What you did, the 8 weeks, the private file, the patience, the way you built this without letting anyone know what you were building so it couldn't leak. She paused. There are people who would have taken what they had at week 4 and moved too soon and given Voss the chance to bury it. You didn't do that. She looked at him steadily. I don't know how to thank you for something this size. He held her gaze for a moment. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. He didn't have the right words for it, which was fine, because she hadn't asked for words. She'd said what she needed to say. He nodded once, which she accepted, and then she picked up her phone and walked toward her office, and the day took them both in its hands and moved them along. The news broke at 2:17 p.m. He watched it through his glass office wall on the large monitor mounted in the security suite, a local news alert that Keisha pulled up without being asked. The crawl at the bottom of the screen read, Pinnacle Group founder Gerald Voss arrested on charges including corporate espionage and conspiracy. The story was bare bones because it had been less than 18 hours, but the shape of it was there. His phone buzzed. Rachel. Is that your case? She texted. He typed back, Don't ask me that on a text. 3 dots appeared. Then, I'll call you tonight. I'm proud of you. He set the phone down and looked at the monitor and let himself feel the thing he hadn't let himself feel during the entire 8 weeks. Not satisfaction exactly, which was too clean a word, But something like resolution, like a weight that had been carried at a tilt, finally set down level. Keisha appeared in his doorway. "Good morning," she said, which was not what morning it was, but which conveyed what she meant. "Good work," he said. "The badge." That was the thread. She nodded, accepted it, and went back to her desk without fanfare, which was the right response, and one of the reasons he was glad she was on his team. The board briefing happened at 4 p.m., and Mason presented the security portion, the breach, the remediation steps, the protocols now in place to prevent recurrence. The board was 6 people around a table, ranging from visibly rattled to visibly furious, to one older man in the far seat, who had the expression of someone doing the math on liability exposure in real time. They asked precise questions, most of which he could answer. The ones he couldn't, he said so, which seemed to surprise at least 2 of them, as if they'd been expecting hedging. Amelia sat at the head of the table and ran the briefing with the quiet authority of someone who has decided to make the room feel her steadiness rather than her alarm. He watched her manage 6 different agendas simultaneously: the scared ones, the angry one, the liability calculator, and bring them all to roughly the same place without anyone feeling they'd been managed. It was something to watch. It was one of those things that looked effortless from the outside, and he knew by now was not effortless at all. The Harwick deal continued. In the days that followed, the space between Mason and Amelia changed in a way that was difficult to name because it didn't announce itself. It was not a rupture, not a declaration, not a moment where one of them said something that could not be unsaid. It was more like the way light changed in a room when a cloud moved, gradual, ambient, and then suddenly obvious once you noticed. He noticed it first in the small things. The way she had started stopping by his office rather than summoning him to hers. Not always, not for official business, sometimes just briefly. A question that could have been an email. The way she'd started asking about Dominic, not as social scaffolding, but with the specific follow-up questions of someone who had been paying attention. How did the game go? The one against Riverside. Not which game, not which team, the one against Riverside. Because she had registered the detail 2 weeks earlier when he'd mentioned it in passing. He noticed it in himself too. The way he had stopped managing the distance with quite the same vigilance. The way he had started answering her questions about Dominic without editing them for professional appropriateness. The way he had told her, on a Wednesday in the kitchen corner while they were both getting coffee, and neither of them had anything scheduled, about the glow-in-the-dark solar system on Dominic's ceiling and the crooked Saturn, and the way she had listened to it, not politely, not with the half-attention of someone waiting for the conversational turn to come back to them, but with the full present tense attention she gave everything that mattered to her. "He sounds like someone I'd like," she said. "He is someone you'd like," Mason said, before he decided to say it. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Neither of them said anything else, and they went back to their separate offices, and Mason sat at his desk for a few minutes, not doing the thing he was supposed to be doing. It was a Friday evening in the 3rd week of November when it actually came to a surface that required navigation. The building was nearly empty. The Harwick closing was 6 days out, and Amelia had been running long days, later and later, and Mason had been running them with her in the ambient way that had become normal. Not because he had to, because his job had regular hours and the crisis had resolved, but because he was there, and she was there, and neither of them had built a firm argument for being elsewhere. They were at the conference table again. She had financial projections spread out. He had nothing in particular, was reading through an updated security protocol, the kind of reading that was necessary but not urgent. There was takeout on the table, a tie again, which had become a thing without anyone deciding it was a thing. The cilantro was already removed from her portion. She looked up from her projections at some point and looked at him, and he looked up from his protocol, and they were looking at each other in the particular way that had been building for weeks, and that he had been very careful to keep below the surface. "You removed the cilantro before I got here," she said. "You always take it out yourself. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do." She looked at the noodles, then at him. "Mason." "Amelia." "This is—" She started and stopped. This was unusual for her. She was precise with language, always. When she started a sentence, she finished it. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "And I am someone who generally knows what to do with things. He set down the protocol. He was not going to have this conversation while holding a security document. I know, he said. You work for me. Yes. That's a real problem. It is, he agreed. She looked at him steadily. I'm not someone who ignores real problems because it's inconvenient to address them. I know that too. So what do we do? He thought about Rachel's voice on the phone, lines you drew before you knew what you were drawing around. He thought about Dominic at the kitchen table, asking if he was happy, with the complete casualness of someone who didn't fully understand the weight of it. He thought about 8 weeks of keeping everything at the right angle, the right distance, the right professional register, and how much of that had been about doing the job correctly and how much had been about something else entirely. I think, he said carefully, that the honest answer is that I don't want to ignore it, and I don't want to pretend there's nothing to ignore. And I also don't want to blow up a situation that's working because I'm impatient about something that doesn't have to be decided tonight. She held his gaze. That's a very controlled answer. I'm a very controlled person. I know, she said. It's one of the things that... She stopped again. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. I've been working since I was 19 years old, she said. I built this company from nothing, and I am proud of that, and I don't need someone to tell me it was impressive. But there have been a lot of years in there where the building was the thing, and everything else was what you did in the margins. She paused. I am not always good at knowing when the margins are where the actual life is. He didn't say anything for a moment. I think the margins are where the actual life is, he said, more often than not. She looked at him. Something in her face was different, the same way the room changed when the cloud moved. That's not a controlled answer, she said. No, he said. It's not. They sat with it. The building was quiet around them. Outside, Chicago was being itself, gray and enormous and moving and completely uninterested in two people in a conference room figuring something out. I'm not asking you to decide anything, he said. I'm just not pretending anymore that there's nothing to decide. She nodded slowly. That's fair, she said. She picked up her fork, set it down. I need a little time to think about what the right structure looks like. For the work, and for... She gestured slightly. The other thing. Take the time, he said. The other thing isn't going anywhere. She looked at him sharply, like she was checking whether he meant that the way it sounded, and he let her see that he did. Okay, she said. They finished the food and worked for another hour, and he drove home with the radio off again, which was still new, and this time he knew what he was thinking about instead of pretending he didn't. The Harwick closing happened on a Tuesday, right on schedule. Mason was not in the room for it. It was attorneys and principals and signatories, and he had no role in the mechanics of it. He ran his regular morning briefing, reviewed the overnight logs, approved a protocol update Keisha had drafted. He was at his desk at 2 p.m. when Diana appeared in his doorway, which was unusual because Diana communicated almost entirely by message. Miss Sterling would like to see you, she said, when you have a moment. He walked down the hall. Amelia was at her desk and he registered this because it was rare, genuinely rare, smiling. Not the small professional acknowledgement she deployed in meetings, a real one, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes and made her look briefly like a different version of herself. The version, he thought, that had been in there all along, underneath the demanding and the fair. It closed, she said. Congratulations, he said. Thank you. She stood. She crossed the room and did something she'd never done before, so she put her hand on his arm briefly, the way you touch someone when the handshake wasn't right, and the hug wasn't right, and what you needed was to make contact with something real. I don't think this would have happened, she said. Not like this. Not intact. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her. You built this, he said. I just protected it. Mason... Her voice had the particular quality it had when she was telling him to stop doing something. Let me say what I'm saying. He let her. You protected something I built, she said. That matters as much as the building. He nodded. She took her hand back. Professional distance reasserted itself, but differently now. Not as a wall, more like the distance between two people who've decided to be careful with something they've admitted is real. I'm taking the afternoon off, she said. I can't remember the last time I took an afternoon off. You should, he said. I know. She looked at him. What time does Dominic get out of school? He blinked. 3:15. Right. She said it like she was noting a fact and filing it. Go get him. He looked at her. My shift doesn't end until, I'm telling you to go get your son, she said. Consider it a direct order from your employer. He stood there for a moment. She held his gaze with the expression she had when she was waiting for him to catch up to something she already knew. Okay, he said. Tell him the Saturn thing is my favorite, she said. The crooked one. I think about it sometimes. He left without knowing what to say to that, which was becoming a pattern with her that he was starting to accept rather than resist. He got to Dominic's school 12 minutes before the bell. He sat in the parking lot in the same place he always sat, in the drop-off line behind the same parents he recognized by their cars now, even if not by their faces. He turned the radio on and then off again. He thought about what Rachel had said. Lines you drew before you knew what you were drawing around. The bell rang and the doors opened and children came out in the organized chaos that school dismissal always was. And then Dominic appeared, shin guards already on because he had practice after school and his backpack listing to one side because he never zipped it all the way. He spotted Mason's car and his face did the thing it always did, the thing Mason could not look at without feeling something enormous and uncomplicated in his chest, which was the specific version of love that didn't have a comparison point. He ran to the car and got in and immediately started talking. Practice was going to be hard today because Coach Reyes said they were doing the scrimmage drill, and Marcus always hogged the left side and it wasn't fair. And Mason pulled out of the lot and listened and said the appropriate things and was more present than he'd been in a while, present in the way that required no effort. Dad, Dominic said, somewhere after the second stoplight. Yeah. You look different. Different how? Dominic studied him from the passenger seat with the assessment that Mason was learning to take seriously. Less like you're thinking about something when no one's watching, he said. Mason drove for a moment. Yeah, he said. Maybe. Is the problem at work fixed? Getting there. Dominic appeared to find this acceptable. He turned and looked out the window at the city going by. Can I get a hot chocolate after practice? Yes. Mrs. Petrakis says hot chocolate after practice builds character. Mrs. Petrakis says a lot of things that happen to support what you already want. Dominic grinned, which was his mother's grin, the one that meant he'd been caught at something and was choosing pride over shame. Yeah, but she's usually right, he said. They drove. The city moved around them, ordinary and enormous. 3 weeks since the arrest. 6 weeks of building a case. 8 weeks since a parking lot outside the Meridian Grand, and a decision made without thinking, which had changed the shape of Mason's life in ways he was still understanding. He thought about Amelia sending him home early, and the way she'd said the Saturn thing is my favorite, the way she said things that were true rather than things that were safe. He thought about the conference table and I don't know what to do with this, and the particular honesty of someone admitting uncertainty when they were someone who almost never had it. He thought about Dominic asking, can I meet her sometime with the total absence of self-consciousness that only 7-year-olds managed? He didn't know exactly what the shape of things would be. He knew there were still complications, professional ones that needed to be worked through with the kind of patience he'd applied to everything else, the kind that came from understanding that the right structure for something took longer to build than the impulse to reach for it. He knew that Amelia was not someone who did things carelessly, that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it with the same rigor she brought to a financial model or an acquisition, and that he found this more reassuring than off-putting because he was someone who respected rigor. He knew that his son was sitting next to him talking about Marcus and the left side of the field, and that the solar system on the ceiling had a crooked Saturn that someone 4 blocks away thought about sometimes, and that this specific cluster of things was the version of his life that felt finally like it was built on ground that could hold weight. Dad? Dominic said. Yeah. 2 hot chocolates, 1 for you. I don't need character, Dominic said firmly. Mrs. Petrakis says. Mason looked at his son. Okay, he said. 2. He pulled into the parking lot of the practice field. Outside, the November city was doing what it always did. Moving, gray, indifferent, enormous. But from inside the car with his kid next to him arguing about character and hot chocolate and the injustice of Marcus on the left side, it felt considerably less indifferent than usual. It felt, against all the odds, that a cleared-out checking account and a clicking transmission and a parking lot on the wrong side of midnight had placed against him, like the beginning of something worth being careful with. He got out of the car and went around to Dominic's side, and watched him grab his bag with the lopsided energy of someone who had not yet learned that enthusiasm and efficiency were separate skills. And they walked toward the practice field together, and the cold came off the lake the way it always did in November, cutting and clean. Whatever came next, it would come from here. From this ground. From whatever got built on it. The hot chocolates were from a place 2 blocks from the practice field that Dominic had discovered 3 weeks earlier and now treated as an institution with a long and distinguished history. The woman behind the counter knew his order. This was, in Dominic's assessment, the mark of a place worth returning to. They sat in the car afterward with the cups steaming between them and watched the last of the practice field lights go off. The other kids had cleared out. Coach Reyes waved from across the parking lot. Mason waved back. Was Marcus better today? Mason asked. He's always better on Tuesdays, Dominic said, with the resignation of someone who had accepted an immovable fact about the universe. I don't know why. Some people just have a Tuesday thing. Dominic considered this seriously. Do you have a day? Used to be Wednesday, Mason said. In the Army. Don't ask me why. Dominic looked at him over his cup. What was the Army like? Mason looked out at the empty practice field, the portable goals still out, the grass worn in the middle where 100 practices had gone before this one. He got this question from Dominic periodically, always phrased slightly differently, always reaching a little further than the last time. The boy was working toward something, building a picture from the pieces Mason gave him, patient in the way that children were patient when they really wanted to understand something. Long, Mason said, and complicated, and I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad I'm here instead. Dominic seemed to find this sufficient. He drank his hot chocolate and didn't push further, which Mason appreciated, and which also made him feel, in the low-key way that parenting regularly produced, that he should probably give more than the minimum. I learned a lot, he said, about how to think, about patience, about what you do when things go wrong and there's no good option, just a least bad one. He paused. I also learned that most problems look bigger at night than they actually are. Dominic thought about this. Is that true? Mostly. Some problems are actually as big as they look, but those are rarer than you think. They drove home in the comfortable quiet that had taken Mason almost 2 years to rebuild with his son. The quiet that didn't require filling, that was just the sound of 2 people who were comfortable being in the same space without performing it. He'd earned it slowly. There had been months after the divorce, after the last deployment, after the consulting work dried up, when Dominic had been quiet in a different way. The watchful quiet of a kid trying to read a room he wasn't sure was safe. Mason had hated that, had worked on it the way he worked on everything that mattered, methodically, imperfectly, with more patience than came naturally. They were past it now, mostly. The mostly was important. He didn't believe in fully past it, in complete resolutions. He believed in mostly and better and ongoing. The Gerald Voss situation moved through its legal stages the way legal situations did, slower than felt reasonable, with more procedural scaffolding than any layperson expected, and with occasional developments that required Mason's attention. Paulson called twice in the first week of December with updates. Voss's attorneys had filed the expected motions, challenged the warrant for the data center on technical grounds that the cybercrime unit had anticipated and documented against. The private intelligence firm, a company called Harston Consulting, which Mason now knew in considerable detail, had flipped early, their principal cooperating with investigators in exchange for considerations that Mason had no official visibility into, but which Paulson communicated in the flat way of someone conveying a fait accompli. The cooperation from Harston was the rope becoming a noose. Their records of the Voss contract were thorough in the specific way of firms that operated in legally gray spaces, and compensated by maintaining documentation as insurance. They had emails, payment records, operational directives. They had a briefing document prepared for the robbery team that included Amelia's schedule, her hotel, her typical movements. They had a follow-up report after the robbery failed, noting that an unexpected intervention by an unidentified subject had compromised the operation and recommending escalation. An unidentified subject. Mason had read that phrase in the case summary Paulson sent him and sat with it for a moment. 3 months ago, he had been an unidentified subject in a parking lot with $43 and a clicking transmission. The chain of consequences from that parking lot was longer than he had fully absorbed until he saw it laid out in someone else's bureaucratic language. He forwarded the relevant portions to Amelia's legal team with his analysis, and did not dwell on the unidentified subject part longer than he needed to. The board reviewed the case in mid-December and passed a formal resolution commending the internal security response. Mason received it in writing, acknowledged it professionally, and put it in a folder. The commendation mattered less to him than the actual outcome, which was the standard he'd applied throughout, and which he understood was not universal, but was his. What happened in December that was not related to Voss or legal proceedings or security protocols was harder to document and more significant in the long run. Amelia had said she needed time to think about what the right structure looked like. She was someone who meant what she said, so he'd given her time. He hadn't manufactured reasons to be in her presence, hadn't pushed the conversation forward before she was ready to push it. He'd done his job and been himself and let the time move. She came to him on a Thursday afternoon, second week of December, walked into his office without knocking the way she sometimes did now, closed the door, and sat in the chair across from his desk. She was in the dark blazer she wore for board days, which meant she'd had a board call that morning, and she had the particular composed but something's been decided look he'd learned over 3 months to recognize. "I talked to my legal counsel," she said. He waited. "About the professional structure, the reporting line." She put a folder on his desk. "The board has approved a reorganization of the executive security function. Effective the first of the year, the head of security role reports directly to the board's risk committee, rather than to me as CEO." He opened the folder, looked at the structure, looked back at her. "That removes the direct reporting relationship," he said. "It does." "Which addresses the professional conflict." "Which addresses the professional conflict," she confirmed. She held his gaze. "I'm not pretending this is purely an organizational efficiency decision. It is also an organizational efficiency decision. Reporting to the risk committee makes structural sense, and I should have set it up this way initially. But I am aware that I am doing 2 things at once here." He looked at the folder again. The reorganization was clean. The structure made sense on its own merits, genuinely. Several of the recommendations he'd made in his first month had pointed toward precisely this kind of board-level integration for enterprise security. She had not constructed a fiction. She had found the place where the legitimate and the personal were the same place, and moved there. "You're careful," he said. "I'm always careful." "I know." He closed the folder. "This is good work." She looked at him with the edge of something that was not quite exasperation but was in that neighborhood. "Mason." "What?" "I just restructured my company's executive reporting lines." "I noticed." "Is that all you're going to say?" He looked at her across the desk. She had her hands folded on the armrest in the particular way she held herself when she was managing the space between what she wanted to do and what she was going to do. He had learned that tell over 3 months, and it was one of the things he most respected about her. The work she put into that space, the deliberateness of it, the refusal to let impulse run ahead of judgment, even when judgment was telling her the same thing impulse was. "No," he said. "It's not all I'm going to say, but I'm not going to say the rest of it in this office." She held his gaze. "When?" "Saturday," he said, "if you're free." "I can be free," she said. "There's a park near my apartment. Dominic has practice in the morning. After that, I usually take him for lunch at a place he's decided is the best restaurant in Chicago, which is objectively not true, but I've stopped arguing about it." He paused. "Come for lunch. Meet the kid who wants to meet you." Something moved through her face, quick and real, the kind of thing she didn't produce when she was managing an impression. "You're sure?" "He asked me in October," Mason said. "I told him maybe. Maybe has become yes." She looked at him for a moment with the direct brown eyes and the composed face, and the something underneath it that she'd been letting him see in increments since a parking lot outside the Meridian Grand. "Okay," she said. "Saturday." She stood, picked up the reorganization folder from his desk, and left. He sat at his desk and looked at the door she'd closed behind her, and then at the window, and at Wentworth Avenue, and at the December city with its early dark and its Christmas lights starting to appear on the buildings, and thought that life was strange and worth it, and that he had not, in his wildest assessment 3 months ago, seen this particular shape of things coming. He called Rachel that night. "She's coming to lunch Saturday," he said before Rachel could say anything else. A pause. Then Rachel, in the specific voice she used when she was trying not to make it a bigger deal than he'd handle. "With Dominic?" "Yeah." A longer pause. "Mason, don't." "I'm not doing anything. I'm just—" He could hear her smiling, which was annoying. "I'm just noting that you're letting someone into the part of your life you protect most. I'm aware of what I'm doing." "Are you nervous?" He thought about it honestly. "A little," he said. "About him, not her. I know how she is with people. I don't know how it'll land with him." "He's going to love her," Rachel said. "He asked to meet her in October. He's been priming for this. He's 7. 7-year-olds are excellent judges of character. Remember, he told you after one day that his second-grade teacher was kind of fake. That woman quit in January." Mason sat with that for a moment. "That's a coincidence." "That's Dominic," Rachel said. "Trust him." Saturday was cold the way December in Chicago was cold, which was a different category from November cold. Deeper, with a wind off the lake that had an opinion about exposed skin. Dominic's practice was at 9 a.m., and Mason stood on the sideline in his heaviest jacket and watched his son play with the focused recklessness that Mason had concluded was simply his natural style on the field, probably untrainable, definitely not from his side of the gene pool. The team won the scrimmage. Marcus was, in fact, dominant on the left side. Dominic accepted this with what appeared to be growing equanimity, which Mason logged as character development. They went home to change, and Mason made sandwiches for the lunch place, because Dominic would not eat if there was no sandwich to precede the restaurant, which was a rule Mason had not created but had learned to accommodate. While they ate, Dominic was quieter than usual. "You okay?" Mason asked. "She's coming today," Dominic said. Not a question. "Yeah." After lunch, Dominic ate his sandwich. He was looking at the table in the way he looked at things when he was organizing his thoughts. "Is she your girlfriend?" Mason considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not yet," he said. Dominic looked up. "But maybe." Maybe. Dominic thought about this. "Does she know about Mom?" Mason set down his sandwich. "She knows I was married and that I'm not anymore. She knows I have you. But does she know about the hard stuff?" This was the part of parenting that nobody warned you about adequately. The moments when your child asked the exact right question in the exact wrong moment, and you had to be honest because lying to a 7-year-old who was looking at you with that particular quality of attention was both impossible and wrong. "Some of it," Mason said. "People learn each other gradually." Dominic seemed to accept this. "I'm not going to be weird," he said, which was an announcement of intent that Mason found both reassuring and slightly concerning in the way that all unsolicited pledges of normal behavior were. "I know," Mason said. "I'm just going to be regular." "Good." "But I might ask her a lot of questions." "That's regular for you," Mason said. "She'll be fine. She likes questions." Dominic picked up the second half of his sandwich. "How do you know she likes questions?" "Because she asks them all the time, and people who ask a lot of questions usually like them back." Dominic processed this and appeared to find it logically sound. The restaurant Dominic had decided was the best in Chicago was a diner on Kellerman called Patsy's, which had been there since before Mason moved to the neighborhood, and which served its cheeseburgers with crinkle-cut fries in a red plastic basket. It was not objectively the best restaurant in Chicago. It was warm and loud, and the woman at the counter called Dominic the soccer player because he'd worn his cleats the first 3 times. Mason had eaten approximately 20 meals there in the past 4 months and had developed an uncomplicated affection for it, Amelia arrived at 12:30. She came in from the cold with her coat on and her cheeks faintly red from the walk from the parking lot, and she looked around the diner with the expression of someone who was genuinely taking it in rather than forming a verdict. And Mason watched Dominic watch her from across the booth with the lateral attention of someone trying to look like they weren't looking. She found their table. She sat across from them, took off her coat, and looked at Dominic directly. "You must be Dominic," she said. "Yes," Dominic said with the formal register he deployed when he was trying to be impressive. "I'm 7. I play soccer." "I know," she said. "Your dad talks about your games." Dominic looked at Mason with an expression of mild betrayal, not at the fact of it, but at not having been informed. "What does he say?" "That you play like you're not afraid of anything," she said. Dominic turned this over. It was clearly not what he'd expected. He looked at Mason again, differently this time, assessing, recalibrating. "That's true," he said. "Marcus is afraid of the left side, but I'm not afraid of the left side." "Who's Marcus?" And that was it. Dominic was gone, launched into a detailed tactical breakdown of his soccer team's dynamics that lasted through the menu and into the ordering and partway through the crinkle-cut fries, and Amelia listened with the same full present-tense attention she gave everything that mattered to her, asking the right questions at the right moments, not performing interest but actually following the thread. And Mason sat across from both of them and felt something in his chest that was too large and too quiet at the same time. The specific feeling of watching a thing you needed happen and not quite trusting it yet. Dominic asked her, around the middle of the cheeseburger, what her job was. "I run a company," she said. "What kind of company?" "Investment. Do you know what investments are?" Dominic thought about it. "Like money?" "Like deciding where to put money so it grows into more money and using it to build things, buildings, businesses, things the city needs." Dominic considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Do you like it?" "Very much," she said. "My dad likes his job now," Dominic said. "He didn't always." Mason looked at his son. "It's true," Dominic said unapologetically. Amelia glanced at Mason, brief and warm, before turning back to Dominic. "I know," she said. "I think he's good at it." "He's good at most things," Dominic said with the casual authority of someone delivering an established fact. "Except he leaves his dishes on the counter instead of in the sink." "Dominic." "That's true too." Amelia was quiet for exactly 1 second before she laughed. An actual laugh, not a polite one, something that surprised her slightly by the look of it. And Dominic looked enormously pleased with himself, and Mason sat there not entirely sure whether he was mortified or grateful. After lunch they walked. This was not planned, but it happened the way things happened when 3 people are in the right mood. Dominic wanted to show her the park where the soccer field was, and they walked the 4 blocks in the December cold. Dominic slightly ahead because he walked like he played soccer, forward and fast, and Mason and Amelia walking beside each other in the easy, unhurried way of people who had gotten past needing to fill the silence. "He's wonderful," she said quietly. "He's a handful." "Those are the same thing," she said, half the time. He looked at her. She was looking ahead at Dominic, who had broken into a run for no discernible reason and was now spinning in the middle of the sidewalk with his arms out, looking at the sky. "Amelia." She turned. "I've been careful," he said, "for a long time, about a lot of things, and I don't regret it, but I'm done being careful about this specific thing." She held his gaze in the December wind. Her hair was moving in it, and she didn't fix it, which was one of those small things he'd noticed without noting, the accumulation of small things that made up knowing someone. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything that isn't right," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just—" He stopped, organized. "I'm just saying I'm here, clearly and without condition." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I've been alone a long time, Mason. Not lonely. Alone." "There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said. "I know you do." She was quiet for a beat. "I'm not going to be easy. I don't know how to not work too much or care too much about the things I'm building. I'm bad at asking for help. I have a brother I don't speak to and a gap in my life where normal people have things I've never gotten around to having." I'm not looking for easy, he said. I know that too. She looked at him with the full directness she brought to everything. I just need you to know what you're walking toward. I've been watching you for 3 months, he said. I know what I'm walking toward. She didn't say anything for a moment. Dominic had stopped spinning and was now examining something on the ground with intense focus, a leaf or a rock, or one of the million things that arrested 7-year-olds without warning. Okay, she said. Okay. She turned back to Dominic. Hey, she called. What did you find? Dominic looked up. A bottle cap, he said. It might be from a really old soda, from like the 80s. The 80s were not that long ago, Amelia said. They were before I was born, Dominic said, with the logic of his generation. They were before you were born, Mason said under his breath. She looked at him sideways, and there it was again. The real thing, the laugh that surprised her, brief and warm in the cold air. They walked back with Dominic between them, still holding the bottle cap, explaining his theory about its origins with the conviction of someone who had decided on a story and was committed to it. And Mason walked on one side and Amelia walked on the other, and the December city moved around them and nobody said anything important for a while, which was exactly right. The Voss case moved toward its resolution in the slow grind of the legal system, which had its own timeline and its own logic entirely separate from anyone's emotional readiness for it to be over. The preliminary hearing was in January. Mason gave his deposition in the second week of the new year. 3 hours with a prosecutor named Delgado, who was thorough and clearly had done this before, walking through every step of the investigation, from the access logs to the data center. He answered every question with the same flat precision he'd brought to every military debrief of his career, and left the room feeling empty in the way that all formal recountings of events produced, like the process of translating lived experience into legal language, took something out that didn't quite go back in. The reorganization took effect on January 1st as planned. Mason's reporting line shifted to the board's risk committee, which was chaired by a former federal security director named Elliot Crane, who had the directness of someone who'd spent 30 years in spaces where ambiguity got people hurt, and who Mason found, after their first meeting, both demanding and fair, the combination he'd described to Dominic months ago that was better than nice. He was still in the same office, still on the same floor, still ran his morning briefings and reviewed the overnight logs and managed his team, which had settled into something he was quietly proud of. Keisha had been formally promoted to deputy head, which was a title she'd earned 6 weeks before he'd given it to her, and the 2 remaining problematic team members had either improved or departed, and the 12 had become 15 with 3 additions who fit the standard he'd established. The work was good. It was the right work for the skills he had, and he did it well. And that was not a small thing. He'd spent enough time doing work that didn't fit to know the difference. What was different now was that after the work there was something else, not instead of alongside. It was not a dramatic transformation. Nobody woke up one morning and found that everything had rearranged itself into a clean new configuration. That was not how it worked, and Mason was constitutionally skeptical of anyone who described their life that way. Because the people who talked about their life changing overnight were usually the same people who hadn't noticed the months of groundwork that made the overnight possible. What happened was accumulation. A Saturday afternoon in January, where Amelia came to the apartment for the first time and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the glow-in-the-dark solar system diagram tacked to the refrigerator, a backup reference Dominic had put up when he was going through his space phase, and said nothing, just looked at it for a moment, and then helped Mason make the pasta he was overcooking and didn't comment on the overcooking, which he appreciated. A Sunday morning where Dominic decided, without consulting either of them, that Amelia should come to the next home game, and communicated this by texting her directly from Mason's phone with the message, "Game is February 8th, you should come," and she had responded within 4 minutes with, "I'll be there." She was there. She stood on the sideline in a coat that was not designed for February soccer weather and watched the whole game with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. And Dominic played like he was performing specifically for someone rather than the general concept of an audience, which Mason recognized as a distinct gear the boy had, and which his coach also recognized, pulling Mason aside after to say, "Whatever you did different today, keep doing it." There were harder moments too, because there always were. A night in February when Amelia's brother called, the one she didn't speak to, and she told Mason about it afterward, not in detail, just the outline, the way you told someone the shape of an old wound when you decided to trust them with the fact of its existence. She didn't ask him for advice or comfort, she just told him, and he listened and said, "That sounds like it's been sitting there a long time." And she said, "It has." And they sat with that, two people in the specific company of each other's unsorted things. He told her about his marriage. Not everything. Some things didn't require full accounting, but enough. The way it had ended, not in a single event, but in the gradual erosion of two people trying to be the same people they'd been before he went away twice, which they couldn't be, which nobody could be after that. He told her about the year after, which had been the hardest year when Dominic was 4 and the consulting work was still alive, and he was trying to build something from the rubble of several things simultaneously. He didn't soften it, she didn't try to fix it. She received it the way he'd received hers, steadily, which was what he'd needed even though he hadn't known he needed it until it was happening. They were not perfect with each other. There were evenings when her work ran until 11 and she didn't call, and he didn't want to be the person who needed a call, and also, honestly, needed a call. There were mornings when he was in his operational mode, tight and internal, and she could feel it and pushed when she shouldn't have, and they both said things that required a brief and civilized retreat before resuming. She was right that she didn't know how to not work too much. He was right that he knew the difference between alone and lonely, because he'd spent a long time navigating that distinction himself and had not always navigated it gracefully. But they were honest. That was the thing that held. Whatever else went sideways, with the bad timing, the separate intensities, the respective defenses they'd each constructed over years of needing them, the honesty stayed. They'd both been in enough situations where the alternative to honesty was catastrophic to have lost patience with the alternative. Dominic, for his part, adapted to the new shape of things with the pragmatism that 7-year-olds brought to change when the change didn't feel threatening. He asked questions, many, as advertised, and received straight answers which satisfied him. He decided around mid-February that Amelia was pretty cool for someone who works a lot, which Mason reported to Amelia verbatim and which she received with the expression she had when something landed squarely and she didn't want to make a thing of it. She came to the apartment more often. She learned where things were without being told. The good mugs were on the second shelf, not the first. The Wi-Fi password was on the side of the router. The overhead light in the kitchen buzzed slightly if you turned it all the way up, and it was better to leave it 3/4. Small geographic knowledge. The kind that accumulated when you spent enough time in a place to stop being a visitor. One evening in March, late, Dominic asleep, the apartment quiet, Mason told her about the $43 checking account. Not because it was relevant to anything being discussed, just because it was true, and because it was one of the things that mattered to the story of how things had gotten to where they were, and he wanted her to have the whole story. She listened. She was sitting on the couch with her shoes off, which had taken 3 months, the shoes off thing. She was someone who remained assembled until she decided a space was safe enough to disassemble slightly in, and he'd noticed the progression without commenting on it. $43, she said, and the transmission clicking. She was quiet for a moment. You could have driven past, she said, that night. Yes. A lot of people would have. I know. She looked at him. Why didn't you? He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it in the car driving home from the Meridian Grand that night, and in the debrief with the young police officer, and in the 100 ambient moments of the months that followed when the question surfaced. He didn't have an answer that was better than the true one, which was not particularly elegant. Because I looked, he said. I looked, and I saw what was happening, and I couldn't not see it after that. She held his gaze. That's who you are, she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an identification, a naming of something. I guess it is, he said. She nodded slowly. Outside, the March wind came off the lake and moved through the street below. The apartment building made its building sounds. Somewhere in the room, the glow-in-the-dark solar system diagram on the refrigerator was faintly visible in the dark of the kitchen, Saturn slightly crooked, the way it always was. I have something to tell you, she said. He waited. The board approved the new executive security structure last week. There's going to be an announcement. She paused. They want to create a chief security officer position, company-wide authority, executive compensation, seat at the leadership table. They've reviewed the Voss case and the breach response and the current team performance. She looked at him. They want you. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant promotion, he said. It is. The board risk committee would still be my reporting line? Yes. Not you. Not me. She held his gaze. I recused myself from the recommendation. Elliot Crane brought it to the full board. It was unanimous. She paused. I'm telling you before the formal offer, so you're not surprised by it. And so you know that it came from them, not from me. He looked at her for a long moment. Why does that distinction matter to you? Because I want you to take it because it's right for you, she said. Not because of this. She gestured slightly, the same vague gesture she'd made in the conference room months ago, meaning everything between them. I don't want you to ever look back and wonder if the career came from the relationship. It didn't. It came from 8 weeks of building a case in a private file that you didn't tell anyone about until you were ready. He sat with this. It was a very Amelia thing. The structural care, the insistence on clean lines even when clean lines required extra work, the refusal to let the personal and the professional bleed into each other in ways that would cost someone something later. I'll take it, he said. You haven't heard the offer yet. I'll take it, he said again. She looked at him. You're not going to negotiate? Elliot Crane is fair, he said. He'll offer what it's worth. She looked at him for a moment longer and then said, okay, in the way she said things when she'd decided they were true, and that was that. The formal offer came the following week. He accepted it. His team reorganized accordingly, with Keisha stepping into the head of security role he vacated, which was the right move and which she received with the same contained competence she brought to everything. He was in the building earlier and later, which was different from before. In the specific way that work you've chosen rather than fallen into was different. The hours were the same, but they sat differently, with a different weight. The Voss case resolved in April. Not the full criminal trial, that would take longer, but the civil case that Sterling Capital had filed moved to a settlement, the terms sealed, substantial. Paulson called to tell him the criminal charges were moving forward regardless of the civil outcome, which meant the system was doing what it was supposed to do, slowly and imperfectly, the way it always did. Mason was in his office when the call came. He looked out the glass wall at the security suite, at Keisha at her station, at the team running the ordinary business of protecting a place. He thought about the night at the Meridian Grand, the sound that was the beginning of a scream that got cut off, the $43, the decision made without thinking that turned out to be the best decision he'd made in years. He thought that the things that changed your life almost never announced themselves as the thing that would change your life. They came at you sideways, in parking lots, on late shifts, in the form of a screaming that got cut off. The announcement came later, if at all, and mostly you were just living the change before you understood it was happening. He called Amelia. She picked up on the second ring. Paulson called, he said. The criminal case is going forward. A brief pause. Good, she said. Then, are you okay? Yeah, he said. I'm good. Come find me when you're done for the day, she said. I want to show you something the architects sent over for the Harwick development. I need another pair of eyes. I'm not an architect. You look at spaces for a living, she said. Close enough. He smiled. He didn't have a view of her office from his, but he knew she was in it, at her desk, probably with 3 things open on her screen and a cold coffee on the corner and the lake visible through the window doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and absolutely beautiful in the April light. Give me an hour, he said. Take 2, she said. The architects are thorough. He hung up and sat for a moment. Then he opened his laptop and got back to work, because that was what you did. You got back to work. And the work was good. And the day was ordinary in all the ways that mattered, which was its own kind of remarkable. In May, Dominic turned 8. They had a party at Patsy's Diner because Dominic had decided it was the best restaurant in Chicago and that his birthday should be spent there. And Mason had agreed, and Amelia had come, and Rachel had driven in from Evanston and spent the first 20 minutes of the party doing the very obvious thing of watching Mason and Amelia interact, and then doing the only slightly less obvious thing of catching Mason's eye across the room and giving a single nod that communicated approximately 14 things simultaneously, in the way that sisters did. Mrs. Petrakis came in a hat she wore for special occasions. Coach Reyes dropped by for 20 minutes. 4 of Dominic's teammates showed up and immediately began fighting over the jukebox. Dominic, in the middle of it, birthday hat on, crinkle fries in hand, surrounded by the loud, ordinary chaos of a party that nobody had planned to be beautiful but was, looked across the table at Mason with the assessment he'd been giving since he was old enough to give it, the one that missed nothing. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, this is a good birthday." "Yeah," Mason said. "It is." Dominic looked at Amelia, who was in a conversation with Rachel that had started cautiously and was now clearly going well given the volume of both of them. Then he looked back at Mason. "I'm glad you went to work at her company," Dominic said. "Me too, buddy. And I'm glad you helped her," he said, "that night, even before you worked there." Mason looked at his son. 8 years old today, shin guards on under the table because old habits, eyes that were his mother's and something else that was purely his own, the specific quality of attention that was going to make his life either very productive or very complicated, possibly both. "Me too," Mason said. Dominic ate a fry and appeared satisfied. He turned back to the party and launched himself back into the noise of it, 8 years old and reckless and forward and utterly unafraid, the way he played soccer, the way he'd apparently decided to approach everything. Mason watched him go and thought about parking lots and $43 and the shape of a life you built versus the shape of a life that happened to you, and whether those were actually different things or just the same thing from 2 angles. He thought about a woman at a dinner table talking about what she'd built and the look on her face when she did. About 8 weeks of patience and a private file and the rope becoming something that held. About professional distance and the work you did to maintain it, and the moment you acknowledged it had already changed. He thought about Crooked Saturn and the kid who'd decided that imperfect was fine, actually, because the thing itself was still there and still worth looking at. Amelia came back to the table. She sat beside him and reached for a fry without asking, which she'd stopped asking permission for sometime around February, and looked at the room full of noise and kids and a birthday that nobody had tried to make beautiful. "This is nice," she said. "It is," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "Where you're thinking something and you decide whether to say it." He looked at her. "I was thinking that I'm happy," he said, specifically and without qualification. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her face, honest and unguarded, the version of her that had been there all along underneath the demanding and the fair. The version that showed up at 6:45 a.m. with cold coffee and stayed until the work was right. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." Outside the diner, the May city was doing what cities do in May. Remembering it could be warm, releasing itself from the long grip of the cold, moving with the particular energy of a place that had been patient through a long winter and was now ready. The lake was blue and enormous and, for once, not indifferent. Or maybe it was always indifferent, and what changed was the people looking at it. Mason Carter was 32 years old. He had a son who thought imperfect Saturn was fine, and that Patsy's was the best restaurant in Chicago, and who would not be wrong about either of those things. He had work that matched what he could do, and a team he'd built from something that wasn't working into something that was. He had a woman beside him who had restructured her reporting lines and shown up in February soccer weather and learned which mugs were on the second shelf and who was not easy, and had said so from the beginning, which was the most honest thing anyone had ever told him before they knew him. He had not expected any of this. He had been in a parking lot at midnight with $43 and a decision that wasn't even a decision, just a reflex, just the only thing he knew how to do when he looked and saw what was happening. That was the thing about the moments that changed everything. You didn't plan them. You just had to be the kind of person who didn't look away. He picked up a fry. The party went on around him. The city moved outside the window. The day was ordinary and sufficient and entirely, unremarkably, his.